The cruelest thing a child can steal from a parent isn't money. It's the feeling that home is still home. I was 68 years old the morning my son disappeared with every dollar my husband and I had saved across 40 years of marriage. Even now, 25 years later, I still remember the sound the kitchen clock made while I stood there staring at the empty coffee cup he had left beside the sink. Tick, tick, tick. Like the house itself was counting the seconds since my life had split into two pieces. Before Daniel left. And after. Back then I lived in a small ranch house outside Dayton, Ohio. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, faded white siding. A porch my husband Thomas had built with his own hands in the summer of 1978. Thomas used to joke that our house leaned slightly to the left because he'd measured one side after drinking 3 beers instead of 2. After he passed from heart failure, I couldn't bring myself to repaint anything. The scratches on the kitchen table, the old baseball glove by the garage shelf, even the dent in the hallway wall from when Daniel was 13 and thought he could skateboard indoors. Those things felt alive to me. They felt like proof that my family had once been whole. Daniel had moved back in after losing his sales job in Columbus. He was 27 then. Tall like his father, charming when he wanted to be, carrying the kind of smile that made people forgive him too quickly. I wanted to believe he was simply going through a hard season. That's what mothers do. We turn warning signs into excuses because the truth hurts too much to hold directly in our hands. Just a few months, Mom, he told me when he arrived with 2 duffel bags and an apologetic grin. I'll get back on my feet. And for a while I believed him. He helped mow the lawn, fixed the porch light, sat beside me during dinner and asked about my day like he was 12 years old again. Some evenings I'd catch myself thanking God that the house didn't feel empty anymore. Looking back now, I think loneliness can blind a person more effectively than love ever could. That morning started quietly. I woke before sunrise because the old pipes always groaned around. 5:30. I tied my robe, shuffled into the kitchen, and noticed Daniel's truck wasn't in the driveway. That didn't seem strange at first. Sometimes he left early for job interviews. I brewed coffee, fed the neighbor's orange cat that kept sneaking onto my porch, and opened the bank envelope sitting near the fruit bowl. I planned to call a roofing company later that week. The estimate had come in around $11,000, and after the winter storms I couldn't put repairs off any longer. My hands started shaking before my mind understood what I was reading. Balance. $312.14. I blinked 3 times. Then I checked the second page. Withdrawal after withdrawal after withdrawal. Our retirement account. The emergency savings Thomas built from overtime shifts at the factory. Gone. Every single penny except $300.14. I remember grabbing the edge of the counter because suddenly the kitchen floor felt uneven beneath me. There was no note beside the coffee cup yet. I found it 10 minutes later after searching Daniel's room. His closet was empty. His drawers were cleared out. The family photograph from his dresser was missing too. All that remained was a folded piece of notebook paper resting on the bare mattress. 2 sentences written in rushed blue ink. I'm sorry, Mom. I had no choice. I sat on the edge of that bed until the sunlight climbed fully through the window. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Somehow that would have felt easier. Instead, I just stared at the wall where his high school basketball poster had once hung, trying to understand how the little boy who used to run into my arms after thunderstorms had become a man capable of destroying the last safe thing his parents ever built together. People in small towns always say they want the truth until the truth becomes uncomfortable to look at every Sunday morning. During the first few weeks after Daniel disappeared, everyone in our church asked how I was holding up. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down brought over a tuna casserole wrapped in foil. The cashier at Miller's grocery squeezed my hand and whispered that she was praying for me. Even the young deputy assigned to my report spoke gently, like he was afraid I might break apart right there beside his desk. But sympathy has an expiration date in places like ours. After a while, people stop seeing your pain and start seeing the inconvenience of it. I filed the police report the same afternoon Daniel vanished. They asked for recent photographs, vehicle information, possible destinations. I answered every question while staring at the framed photograph hanging behind the receptionist's desk. Some smiling family fishing beside a lake somewhere in Michigan. A father holding a little girl on his shoulders. I remember thinking how strange it was that ordinary happiness could still exist in the world while mine had just collapsed in less than an hour. The deputy told me adults were allowed to leave voluntarily. Unless there was evidence of fraud beyond the bank withdrawals, there was only so much they could do. Maybe he panicked, he said carefully. Sometimes people come back once they calm down. I nodded because I needed to believe that. For the first 3 months I barely slept through a single night. Every time headlights passed my window after dark, my heart jumped into my throat. I kept imagining Daniel walking up the porch steps with tears in his eyes, apologizing, telling me he had made some terrible mistake he could fix. I left the porch light on every evening until sunrise. I do not think I ever admitted that to anyone before. The hardest part was not the missing money. It was the silence. Daniel had always been loud even when he was quiet. He whistled while making sandwiches, tapped his fingers on countertops, left cabinet doors open no matter how many times I corrected him. After he vanished, the house sounded hollow in a way I cannot fully explain. The refrigerator humming became unbearably noticeable. The ticking kitchen clock felt sharper. Even my own footsteps startled me sometimes. I hired a private investigator 6 months later after selling Thomas's old fishing boat. The investigator was a tired-looking man named Carl who smelled faintly of peppermint gum and cigarette smoke. He tracked a few credit card charges through Indiana and New Mexico before the trail disappeared completely. "Your son does not want to be found," he finally told me across the diner table one rainy afternoon. Hearing those words out loud felt worse than the theft itself. Because until then, some stubborn part of me still believed Daniel was trapped somewhere by circumstances beyond his control. After that meeting I stopped calling hospitals, stopped checking unknown phone numbers, stopped expecting footsteps on the porch at night. But the town remembered longer than I wanted it to. At the grocery store, conversations lowered when I entered an aisle. Some people looked at me with pity. Others looked almost relieved that tragedy had chosen somebody else's family instead of theirs. One afternoon at the beauty salon I overheard a woman whisper, "If he stole from his own mother, imagine what she must have ignored while raising him." I sat there beneath the hairdryer pretending not to hear a single word. Shame has a way of making even innocent people feel guilty. Money became tight quickly. Without the savings, retirement disappeared like smoke. I took a part-time job stocking shelves at Miller's Grocery 3 evenings a week. My knees ached constantly by then, but I smiled at customers and bagged canned soup beside high school students young enough to be my grandchildren. At home, I learned how to keep lights off in empty rooms to lower the electric bill. I canceled cable television, sold my wedding china, patched winter drafts with old towels beneath the doors. Through all of it, I never touched Daniel's bedroom again. I closed the door the day he left and kept it closed through birthdays, Christmas mornings, thunderstorms, and lonely Ohio winters. Dust gathered inside while the rest of the world moved forward without us. And little by little, the town stopped asking where my son had gone because eventually people become comfortable with other people's heartbreak when it lasts long enough. Time does not heal everything the way people claim it does at church potlucks and funeral receptions. Sometimes time simply teaches you how to carry pain without dropping it in public. By the 25th year after Daniel disappeared, my life had become small, quiet, and predictable in ways that no longer frightened me. I woke every morning at 6:30. I watered the hydrangeas beside the porch Thomas built. I drank 1 cup of black coffee while listening to the local weather report on the radio. The world had changed around me during those years. Cell phones became tiny computers. The grocery store replaced half its cashiers with self-checkout machines that I still did not trust. Children stopped riding bicycles through neighborhoods and started staring down at glowing screens instead. But inside my little house outside Dayton, certain things remained frozen in place. Daniel's bedroom door stayed shut. The faded family photograph above the fireplace stayed crooked because Thomas had always promised to fix it someday. And every Thanksgiving, I still cooked enough mashed potatoes for 4 people before realizing halfway through dinner that there were only 1.5 portions being eaten. The half belonged to grief. Linda Graves was the only person who never stopped treating me like I was more than the mother of a son who vanished. We had been neighbors for nearly 30 years. She brought me soup during flu season, forced me to attend church bake sales when I wanted to stay home, and once drove through a snowstorm because she was convinced I sounded lonely on the phone. Isolation makes sadness louder, she used to tell me. You have got to keep the world from shrinking too small. When Linda passed away from a stroke at 72, the entire town showed up for her funeral. The church smelled faintly of lilies and old hymn books the way funeral homes always do. I remember sitting in the third pew, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my black skirt, while the organ music echoed softly through the sanctuary. Most of the faces around me had grown older alongside mine. Gray hair, reading glasses, slower steps. It felt strange how quickly 25 years could disappear inside other people's faces. After the service ended, everyone gathered downstairs for coffee and casseroles. I was reaching for a paper cup near the dessert table when I noticed a young woman standing alone beside the hallway entrance. She could not have been older than 24. Long blonde hair pulled back loosely, denim jacket, nervous hands twisting together like she regretted walking into the room. At first, I assumed she was somebody's granddaughter from out of town. But then she looked directly at me, and something inside my chest tightened before she even spoke. It was the eyes. Daniel had inherited Thomas's pale blue eyes, the kind that looked almost silver in winter light. This girl had the exact same eyes. She walked toward me slowly, as though approaching a wild animal she did not want to startle. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked softly. I remember gripping the paper coffee cup harder because suddenly my fingers felt numb. "Yes." The girl swallowed visibly before speaking again. "My name is Emma Carter." She paused for a second that somehow felt endless. "I think Daniel Whitmore was my father." The room did not spin dramatically the way people describe shock in movies. Instead, everything became painfully sharp. I noticed the hum of the soda machine near the wall, the smell of cinnamon rolls on the dessert table, the tiny crack running through the church tile beneath my shoes. I stared at this stranger while my heart pounded so hard it hurt. "You are mistaken," I said automatically, even though deep down I already knew she was not. Emma shook her head carefully. "I am sorry. I did not come here to upset you." Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. The moment I saw the initials engraved into the metal, the air seemed to leave my lungs completely. T.W. Thomas Whitmore. My husband's initials. The key had disappeared the same year Daniel did. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The church fellowship hall buzzed quietly around us with the sound of forks against paper plates and polite funeral conversations, but all I could hear was the rushing sound inside my own ears. I stared at the brass key resting in Emma's open palm, and suddenly I was standing 25 years in the past again, watching Daniel carry boxes through my kitchen while Thomas laughed about teaching him how to drive a stick shift. That key had once hung inside our garage on a wooden hook beside Thomas's workbench. I remembered dusting around it for years without ever asking what it opened because married people collect small mysteries over time and eventually stop noticing them. Then one day after Thomas died, the key disappeared. And now somehow it had returned in the hands of a stranger calling herself my granddaughter. "Where did you get this?" My voice sounded thinner than I intended. Emma lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "My father gave it to me." She hesitated carefully. 3 months before he died. The word died settled over me strangely. Not sharp like a knife. Duller than that. Like a heavy coat being draped across shoulders already carrying too much weight. I realized then that for 25 years, some hidden part of me had continued imagining Daniel alive somewhere under a different sky. Older maybe. Sad maybe. But breathing. Existing. The finality inside Emma's voice cracked something loose inside my chest that I had unknowingly protected all those years. I leaned against the dessert table for balance. "How did he die?" Emma answered gently, almost cautiously, like someone approaching broken glass barefoot. "Heart failure. In Phoenix." My stomach tightened immediately at the irony of it. Thomas had died from the same thing. I wondered suddenly whether Daniel had known that during his final days. Whether it frightened him to hear his own heartbeat weakening the same way his father's once had. Emma glanced around the crowded room before speaking again. "I know this is not the place for this conversation. I almost did not come." "Then why did you?" The question escaped harsher than I intended. Pain has a way of sharpening even polite words. But Emma did not react defensively. Instead, she looked down at the key again and rubbed the worn leather tag between her fingers. Because he asked me to. We moved into the empty church library, a few minutes later, where old hymnals and donated paperbacks lined the shelves. The room smelled faintly like dust and coffee grounds. Rain had started tapping softly against the windows outside. Emma sat across from me at a folding table, shoulders tense, as though she expected me to stand up and leave at any moment. "My father talked about you all the time," she said quietly. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because it felt impossible. A man who disappears for 25 years does not spend much time thinking about his mother. Emma swallowed hard before responding. He did. Every birthday. Every Christmas. He kept a photograph of you in his wallet until the edges wore apart. I looked away because anger was easier to carry than grief, and her words threatened to disturb the careful balance I had built over decades. Did he ever explain why he stole from me? Emma's eyes filled slightly, though she blinked the emotion back quickly. He said he made terrible mistakes when he was young. He said he spent most of his life trying to become someone who deserved forgiveness. Forgiveness. The word felt exhausting. I had spent years imagining what I would say if Daniel ever came home. Sometimes I imagined slamming the door in his face. Sometimes I imagined collapsing into tears. But now there would be no dramatic reunion. No answers directly from him. Only this quiet young woman sitting across from me holding pieces of a life I no longer understood. Emma carefully slid the brass key across the table toward me. Before he died, he told me to bring this to you personally. Her voice softened even more after that. He said you would know what it belonged to. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up. The metal still carried the same tiny scratch near the base from when Thomas accidentally dropped it onto concrete decades earlier. Suddenly another memory surfaced so clearly it nearly stole my breath. Thomas standing in the garage one summer evening saying, "If anything ever happens to me, Margaret, Robert Hale knows about the box." At the time, I had barely listened because Daniel was arguing with the neighbor's son outside and dinner was burning in the oven. But now those words echoed through my mind with terrifying clarity. Robert Hale. Thomas's old attorney. The one I had not spoken to in more than 20 years. The next morning I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for nearly 10 minutes before leaving the house because I could not decide whether I looked more frightened or more foolish. At 68 years old, you think life stops surprising you. You think the worst things already happened and settled into place long ago, like old furniture nobody bothers moving anymore. But there I was, fastening pearl earrings with trembling hands because a dead son had suddenly returned to my life through a young woman carrying a brass key and 25 years of unanswered questions. Emma offered to drive, but I refused politely. I still did not know what to make of her. Some moments when she tilted her head while listening, I saw Daniel so clearly it hurt to breathe. Other moments she felt like a complete stranger wearing pieces of my family by accident. We followed each other across town through gray November drizzle, until we reached the brick office building where Robert Hale still practiced law. The sign outside looked smaller than I remembered. Everything from my younger years seemed smaller now. Robert opened the office door himself after his receptionist announced us. He had to be close to 80 by then. His hair was completely white, and he walked slower than I remembered, but his eyes sharpened the second he saw the brass key in my hand. "Well," he said quietly, "I wondered if this day would ever come." A cold feeling settled beneath my ribs. "You knew about this?" Robert glanced toward Emma before stepping aside. "Come into my office, Margaret." The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Framed degrees still hung crookedly behind his desk, exactly the way Thomas used to tease him about. Emma sat silently beside me while Robert opened a locked filing cabinet and removed a thin manila folder yellowed with age. "Your husband came to see me about 6 months before he passed," Robert explained carefully. "He established a private safe deposit box under instructions that it remained sealed unless someone presented that key." I stared at him in disbelief. "Thomas never told me any of this." Robert gave a tired smile. "He intended to. But your husband believed in waiting for the right moment. Sometimes people wait too long." Those words lingered painfully between us because both of us knew another man in my life who had done exactly that. 20 minutes later, we sat inside a private viewing room at First National Bank while an employee carried out a small gray lockbox. The same brass key slid smoothly into the lock as though 25 years had passed in a single breath instead of an entire lifetime. I expected money inside. Or legal documents. Maybe even proof that Daniel had hidden what he stole. But when the lid opened, what struck me first was how ordinary everything looked. A stack of papers tied with faded string. An envelope addressed in Thomas's handwriting. A photograph of the three of us standing beside Cedar Lake during summer vacation in 1983. Daniel looked maybe 12 years old in the picture, grinning proudly beside a fish too small to justify the smile on his face. Beneath the photograph sat several savings bonds and property records I did not recognize. Robert adjusted his glasses while examining the documents. "Margaret," he said slowly, "your husband established a secondary trust years ago." "A trust?" "Yes. Separate from your primary retirement savings." My pulse quickened immediately. "How much?" Robert looked through several pages before answering. "Adjusted for time and interest, approximately $380,000. The room became completely silent. I actually thought he had misspoken at first. Thomas and I had never possessed that kind of money. We lived carefully our entire marriage. Coupons in kitchen drawers. Shared Christmas gifts. Years of factory overtime just to stay ahead of mortgage payments. "That cannot be right," I whispered. Robert slid the papers toward me gently. "It appears your husband purchased undeveloped land outside Columbus in the early 1970s before property values increased. The trust remained untouched for decades." My eyes drifted toward Emma, who looked just as stunned as I felt. Then I noticed another envelope resting alone beneath the documents. Newer than everything else. White paper. My name written across the front in handwriting I had not seen for 25 years. "Mom." My throat tightened instantly. "That is not your husband's writing," Robert said quietly. I already knew that. Because no mother forgets the handwriting of the child she once helped learn the alphabet. My hands would not stop trembling as I held the envelope. For 25 years, I had imagined hundreds of different versions of what I might say if I ever heard from Daniel again. In some versions I screamed at him. In others I asked questions that had haunted me through sleepless nights and lonely Christmas mornings. But sitting there inside that quiet bank room beside a granddaughter I never knew existed, all I could do was stare at my son's handwriting like it belonged to someone who had died decades before his body actually did. Emma sat silently across from me, her expression careful and uncertain. Robert removed his glasses and looked toward the window, giving me privacy without leaving the room. I slid one finger beneath the envelope flap slowly, almost afraid the words inside might destroy whatever fragile balance remained in my life. The paper crackled softly as I unfolded the letter. "Mom, if you are reading this, it means Emma found the courage to come see you. I pray you gave her more kindness than I earned from you myself." I stopped there for a moment because tears had already blurred the ink. Not dramatic sobbing tears. Just the quiet kind older people learn to cry after enough disappointments. The letter continued in the same uneven handwriting I remembered from permission slips and birthday cards long ago. Daniel wrote that he had started gambling shortly after losing his sales job. At first he convinced himself it was temporary. A few $100s here and there. Then thousands. Debt piled up faster than he could control. He borrowed from dangerous people and believed one lucky break would solve everything before anyone noticed. But life rarely collapses all at once. Usually it crumbles slowly through 100 selfish decisions disguised as temporary solutions. According to the letter, Daniel discovered shortly before taking our savings that a woman he had once dated in Arizona was pregnant with Emma. Around the same time, the men he owed money to began threatening lawsuits and criminal charges. He wrote that panic swallowed him whole. He convinced himself he could take the money, disappear temporarily, win enough back to return everything quietly before I ever knew it was gone. But once he fled Ohio, the situation spiraled beyond repair. Reading those words hurt more than I expected because they sounded so painfully human. Not monstrous. Not evil. Just weak. Frightened. Foolish. The kind of mistakes ordinary people make before realizing consequences can stretch across entire lifetimes. Then I reached the part that made my chest tighten so sharply I had to lower the paper. "I never spent all the money, Mom." Robert leaned forward slightly. Emma looked confused because she clearly had never seen the letter herself. Daniel explained that after several years working construction jobs under different names across Arizona and Nevada, guilt consumed him so completely he began secretly rebuilding what he had stolen. He discovered the trust Thomas established shortly before leaving Ohio because he found paperwork hidden inside the garage workbench. Instead of touching it, Daniel contacted Robert anonymously years later and arranged for portions of his earnings to be transferred into the trust through shell accounts and money orders. Little by little, year after year. "I could never undo what I did," he wrote, "but I wanted you to have something back before I died." I lowered the letter slowly and stared at the table while memories collided painfully inside my head. All those years I pictured Daniel living carelessly somewhere while I worked aching shifts at the grocery store and sold pieces of my life to survive. Meanwhile, my son had apparently spent decades carrying shame like a stone tied around his neck. It did not erase what he did. But suddenly the story no longer felt as simple as betrayal. Emma finally spoke in a small voice. "He worked all the time when I was growing up. Roofing, drywall, air conditioning repair. He never bought himself anything." I looked at her then and noticed tears balancing carefully along her lower eyelids. "Why did he never come home?" Emma swallowed hard before answering. "Because he believed you deserved better than the man he became." The room fell silent again except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I looked back down at the final paragraph of Daniel's letter. There was one sentence underlined twice in shaky blue ink. "I carried my shame for 25 years, but the heaviest part was knowing my mother carried it too." The drive home from the bank felt strangely quiet, even though Emma spoke several times during the hour back to Dayton. I answered politely when necessary, but most of my thoughts remained trapped somewhere between the past and present, shifting through memories that no longer fit together the way they once had. For 25 years, I had built my grief around certainty. Daniel betrayed me. Daniel abandoned me. Daniel chose himself over family. Those truths had become the foundation beneath every lonely holiday and every sleepless night. But now the edges of those truths felt blurred by details I never expected to hear. Shame, regret, secret repayments. A daughter he protected while hiding from the wreckage of his own mistakes. It did not excuse what he had done, yet somehow it made the loss feel heavier instead of lighter. Emma followed me into the house carrying the cardboard box of documents from the bank. She paused just inside the front door and looked around quietly. "This is exactly how he described it," she whispered. I set my purse down slowly. "He talked about this house often?" Emma nodded. "All the time." Her eyes drifted toward the old floral wallpaper near the kitchen. "He said Grandma Margaret never changed anything because she believed memories lived inside walls." My throat tightened unexpectedly because those were my exact words from years ago. I had said them once while Daniel helped Thomas repaint the garage. Somehow my son had carried that small memory across decades in states and disappointments. Emma carefully placed the box on the dining room table. "There is something else I should probably show you." She reached into her shoulder bag and removed a worn leather notebook held together with a cracked elastic band. "He kept journals." I stared at the notebook without touching it. Journals. Mostly dates, thoughts, things he wanted to remember. She gave a nervous little shrug. "Your birthdays are all marked inside. Every single one." My chest ached with a strange mixture of anger and tenderness I could barely separate anymore. Emma opened the notebook carefully and turned several pages before sliding it toward me. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Daniel. Some entries were short. "Worked 14 hours today. Roof repair outside Tucson. Thought about calling Mom. Could not do it." Others stretched longer across entire pages about regrets, memories, and dreams that never happened. One entry stopped me completely. November 12th. Mom turned 63 today. I still remember her making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs when I was sick in second grade. I stole money from the only person who ever loved me without conditions. I hope she stopped blaming herself years ago. I closed the notebook because suddenly I could not breathe steadily enough to continue reading. Emma looked down at her hands. "He blamed himself for everything," she said quietly. "Even small things. If our car broke down, he acted like he deserved it somehow." I walked slowly into the kitchen and stood beside the sink for several seconds, staring out toward the backyard where Thomas once built Daniel a crooked tree swing. The maple tree still stood there, older and thinner now. Time changes everything eventually, even things that seem permanent. Did he ever talk about why he never contacted me directly? I asked softly. Emma hesitated before answering. He wrote letters sometimes. I turned back toward her immediately. Letters? She nodded. Dozens of them. Then she reached into the bag again and removed a bundle tied carefully with blue ribbon. My knees nearly gave out when I realized what I was looking at. Envelopes. All addressed to me in Daniel's handwriting. None mailed. None opened. 25 years of words trapped inside paper because my son could not find the courage to send them. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while Emma placed the bundle gently in front of me like something fragile enough to break. He kept them in a shoebox beside his bed, she explained. The night before he died, he made me promise to bring them here. My fingers brushed across the top envelope carefully. The postmark spaces were all blank. Every apology, every confession, every attempt to come home had remained sealed shut by fear. Without fully thinking about it, my eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the closed bedroom door that had remained untouched for 25 years. Emma followed my gaze silently. You do not have to open it if you are not ready, she said gently. But for the first time in decades, I realized the room no longer felt haunted by betrayal alone. Somewhere inside those walls still existed the boy who loved dinosaur pancakes and left muddy shoes by the back door, and once believed his mother could fix anything. Slowly, before I could lose my nerve, I stood up and walked toward Daniel's bedroom. The bedroom door had not been opened in 25 years, and yet when I stood in front of it that afternoon, I realized I still remembered exactly how the handle felt beneath my hand. Cold metal. Slightly loose from the time Daniel and his father tried to fix it together, and argued about which screwdriver was the correct one. Emma stood quietly behind me in the hallway, not speaking, as if she understood that whatever happened next belonged entirely to me. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else in the house. For a long time I simply stared at the door. I had closed it the day Daniel left and never once allowed myself to reopen it, not even during the worst nights when memory itself felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I told myself it was because I wanted to preserve what little order remained in my life. But the truth, the one I never admitted out loud, was simpler. I was afraid that opening it would make the absence real in a way I could never reverse. Finally, I turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak that echoed down the hallway like a question I had avoided for decades. The room inside was exactly as I had left it, yet completely transformed by time. Dust covered every surface in a thin gray layer that softened the edges of everything. The bed was still made, though the sheets had lost their color. The posters on the wall had curled at the corners, fading into shades of yellow and brown. The air smelled faintly of wood and paper and something distant I could only describe as memory itself. I stepped inside slowly. Each step felt like walking through a place that no longer belonged to the present. Emma followed but stopped near the doorway, respecting the silence. My eyes moved across the room without intention. The desk where Daniel once studied. The empty bookshelf where he kept baseball trophies. The corner where he once sat for hours playing music too loudly, while I pretended to complain but secretly enjoyed hearing him alive in the next room. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Then I saw it. A simple cardboard box placed carefully under the bed, as if someone had hidden it there with deliberate intention rather than haste. My knees weakened slightly as I lowered myself to pull it out. Dust rose into the air as I lifted the lid. Inside were small, carefully preserved fragments of a life I thought had ended without explanation. A folded school award from his senior year. A broken watch I remembered him wearing constantly during high school. A small plastic figurine from a restaurant kids' meal that I had once threatened to throw away but never did because he insisted it was lucky. And beneath all of it, wrapped in an old towel, was a second box. This one smaller. Heavier in meaning than in weight. I hesitated before opening it. Emma stepped closer behind me but did not speak. Slowly I lifted the lid. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to me. My name written in the same handwriting I had been staring at for days now. Some envelopes were sealed carefully. Others looked worn from being opened and closed repeatedly, as if he had changed his mind many times. I picked up the top letter with shaking fingers. The date written on the front was from 23 years ago. My hands tightened around it as I realized something painful. He had been trying to speak to me long before Emma ever arrived at my door. I opened the first letter. The ink was slightly faded but still clear enough to read. Mom, I do not expect you to forgive me. I do not even know if you would recognize the man I have become. I carry your face with me every day, and it is the hardest thing I own. I stopped reading because my vision blurred unexpectedly. I placed the letter down carefully and picked up another. Then another. Each one carried the same pattern. Apologies. Regrets. Attempts to explain what could never truly be explained. Years passing in silence while my son wrote to me as if distance alone could somehow protect me from the truth of what he had done. Emma knelt beside me quietly and picked up one of the envelopes. He used to sit at the kitchen table at night and write for hours, she said softly. Sometimes he would read them out loud to me before putting them away. I closed my eyes for a moment, and for the first time I tried to imagine not the man who stole from me, but the man who spent his nights alone trying to become someone worthy of returning. The realization did not erase the pain. It did not fix what was broken, but it shifted something inside me that I had not expected. The anger was still there. The loss was still there. But now so was something else. Something quieter. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding. I looked around the room again, no longer seeing only absence, but traces of a boy who had once lived here and loved me in the only way he knew how. And for the first time since the day he left, I did not turn away. The first Thanksgiving after everything came together again felt nothing like the holidays I remembered from the years when life still made simple sense. I woke before sunrise out of habit, the same way I had for decades, and stood in the kitchen staring at a house that no longer felt empty in the same way it once did. Emma was asleep in the guest room down the hall. Her presence had slowly become part of the rhythm of the house, not as an intrusion, but as something unexpected and strangely gentle, like a light left on in a room you thought you would never enter again. I moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing food I did not fully need anymore, yet still felt compelled to make. There was something healing in repetition, even when the reason behind it had changed. The same oven Thomas installed. The same worn countertops. But now, for the first time in many years, there was also conversation again in this house. Not loud, not forced, just real. Emma had stayed after the day in Daniel's old bedroom. Not for a visit. Not out of obligation. But because neither of us was ready for her to leave. She told me about her life in Arizona, about working part-time at a small clinic, about the quiet years she and her father had shared in rented apartments and temporary homes. She never once spoke of bitterness toward him, only understanding layered with a sadness she did not try to hide. Over the following days, we began to rebuild something neither of us had expected. Not the past. That was impossible. But something adjacent to it. A version of family that had been broken and reassembled in a different shape. Emma helped me sort through the letters Daniel had left behind. There were so many that we could only read a few each night. Some made me cry quietly in the chair beside the window. Others left me staring into silence for long stretches of time. But none of them brought back the anger the way I had once feared they would. Instead, they left behind something more complicated. A recognition that love and failure had always existed side by side in ways I never fully understood when I was younger. One evening, Emma asked me if I would ever forgive him completely. I did not answer immediately because forgiveness is not a word that fits neatly into the life of someone who has lived long enough to understand consequences. Instead, I looked toward the backyard where the old maple tree still stood. The same tree where Daniel once swung too high as a child and laughed without fear. I do not think forgiveness is something you arrive at all at once, I finally said. It is something you learn how to carry without letting it break you further. Emma nodded. And for the first time I saw something like peace settle in her expression. On Thanksgiving morning I set the table the way I always had, even when there were years I thought no one would sit at it again. I placed 3 plates instead of 1. One for myself, one for Emma, and one that I did not move after placing it. The house was quiet in a different way now. Not empty, not haunted, just full of memory that no longer demanded pain in exchange for its presence. Emma entered the room wearing a simple sweater and paused when she saw the extra plate. She did not ask questions. She simply sat down across from me. We ate slowly, not because of hunger, but because of time itself feeling unfamiliar again in a good way. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the last of autumn toward winter. After a while, Emma reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over mine. It was not a dramatic gesture. There were no tears, no sudden revelations, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed permanently in both of us. Later that afternoon, I walked alone to the backyard and stood beneath the maple tree. I thought about Thomas. I thought about Daniel. I thought about all the years I had spent believing that loss meant absence, when in truth it had simply meant transformation. The wind moved through the branches above me, and for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like I was standing at the center of a story that had ended too soon. I felt like I was standing in the middle of something still continuing, shaped by everything that had come before, yet no longer defined only by it.